Thank you all for taking time out of your schedules to be here this evening. We're so incredibly fortunate to have Antipas Harris join us at the center tonight. Antipas is interesting, and he's local, and I very much encourage you to ask questions. I encourage you to get to know him, and I encourage you to see him as a resource, because he's very, very generous with his life and with his time. Antipas has graduate degrees from Emory and Yale and Boston and St. Thomas, and he is the founder, president, and dean of the Urban Renewal Center here in Norfolk. The former founding president and dean of Jake's Divinity School in Dallas, Texas, and during a time in which race is such a key issue, and during a time in which white Christian nationalism has been, has bared its head all over the place. We're particularly fortunate to have him here. I also said to him, wow, this book came out during COVID, and so I never had a chance to hear him speak, so we're fortunate to have him here. Thank you so much, Dr. Harris.
Dr. Wansink, it's a delight to be here. Kelly, thank you for the invitation and the helping me put it all together. It's a delight to meet all of you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here this evening, and I hope what I have to say is at least interesting, even if you came out at night. I mean, this is like real live people in an auditorium post-COVID. So this is like a sacrifice. So thank you for being here. Oh, yes, I am Antipas Harris, originally from a little town called Manchester, Georgia. And I have 7 brothers and sisters. Mom and dad are still there, and all 8 of us are scattered up the eastern seaboard. And I was the furthest away at one point. I was in Dallas, and I'm back here now, so I'm grateful to be here. I spent 10 years as a university professor at Regent University, and I left the university in 2017, just after the national optics were Minnesota and Kansas. There was one, Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were killed in the same week by police, and that Friday of that same week, 5 police officers were killed in Dallas, Texas. So I left with the question, what can I do with my life that will make impact for the future, and started the Urban Renewal Center, which is a center for moral thought, voice, and action, with a vision of bringing people together and finding ways to reintroduce the idea of human kaleidoscope and community diversity, rather than silos, police against community, white against black, Jews against Christians, Christians against Jews, Christians against Muslims, all these factions that create hostility in our community. One of the common denominators of healing is conversation. It's hard to really want to kill the person you actually like, and you like people who you are in relationship with. And usually you humanize people by getting to know them. When I was at Regent University, this book was born when I was a professor at Regent University. I was in a class on leadership, and a student paused and asked a question that prompted my study that produced this book. Before going to that question, I want to start by pointing out this book was published by Ivy Press, and it is broken up into 4 parts. Part 1, the church and the threatening contemporary ideas. And 4 chapters are in that part. The striking question, the question I'll get to in just a moment. 2, a crisis of faith, the quest for the souls, the church and the search for identity. And part 2 has 3 chapters. This part is entitled, Have We Been Taught to Misread the Bible? And the 5th chapter is the Christian scandalous thinking, the color of the Bible, and the question, the Genesis curse. And part 3, a faith that cares about people from different cultures. and chapter 8, reading the New Testament through dark lens, and chapter 9, social justice and the Bible. And then the end, there's one chapter in part 4, where do we go from here? The streets are waiting. A new way to think about the faith. I want to start with part 1, the church and threatening contemporary ideas, by focusing on that striking question in chapter 1 that prompted my study that produced this book. A graduate student, he was 22 years old, and I was teaching a course on leadership, and he interrupted me about this amount of time into the lecture. He raised his hand and said, "Dr. Harris, what do you say to your friends when who are leaving the church and arguing that Christianity is the white man's religion?" Now, frankly, I was taken aback by the question because it had absolutely nothing to do with what the class was about. And I've been teaching for a long time and thought, is this a strategy to throw me off because he didn't read for class today? Is he derailing my lecture so that we don't get on, what is going on here? But I looked in his eyes and he seemed very sincere. And so I prodded him a bit more to ask, to talk more about the question. Because I thought that the question 1, my first reaction was, is he derailing the lecture? My second question was, why is he asking this anachronistic question? Because what triggered in my memory was Malcolm X raised this question in the 1950s and 60s, and I thought, well, that's an old question. We've already answered that question and moved on from civil rights. But the more he talked, the more I realized the question I wasn't as woke as I should be. How is that? Because the question is very vibrant on the streets across America. And when he started to explaining that his cousins and friends from his church were leaving the church, and then other students in the class started to give in their stories about friends who had left the church and people they knew about around the way who had left the church and said it's the white man's religion and the Bible is the white man's book. And so the conversation carried after class, and we talked in the hallways a bit about the question, and I thought to myself, why don't I do some research around this and just see where we are in our society and understand where the question is coming from. And while I was pondering to understand where the question is coming from, because I'll parenthetically say, usually when these type of questions are asked, if you're a person who committed to that thing that is being deemed a pejorative question or indictment on it, you become defensive, right? No, it's not, no, it's not. And I thought to myself, restrain the idea of being defensive and try to understand the question. So my research was not how can I argue my answer to the question. My primary research was how can I understand with greater depth the question and where the question is coming from. And why would a question that was a vibrant question in the 1950s and 60s be resurfacing primarily in urban America? That's what drove my research on this book. Now, when I started my pursuit of study around this question, Bishop T.D. Jakes, you may have heard his name, may not have, but he's a very prominent pastor, movie producer, and he does a major conference every year for pastors and leaders. It draws about 11,000 people. And so about 2 weeks later, after this student raised this question in class, he called me on a Saturday morning and said, hey, I'm doing my conference coming. It was in February. I remember February, his conference was in May. He said, and I want to do a global think tank, and I want to do it on the state of the faith in light of different movements in our communities that are attracting young people from the church. And I said, oh, tell me more. He said, like Black Hebrew Israelites, and I'll get to that in just a minute. He says, we're losing a lot of our young people in the church for these sorts of organizations. And in some cases, they are distracting services and so forth. And so immediately I said, a student just brought that up to me the other day, or a couple weeks ago, And I've been doing a little bit of study on that. So I'll get some scholars together and we'll sort of ponder this question. So long story short, he invited me to the conference. I put the scholars together and I moderated the conference that day. 8,000 people showed up for that think tank. We didn't think that many people were going to show up for the think tank. We thought, 400 or 500, but 8,000 showed up. And the amount of people that were saying, oh yeah, I know somebody, oh my church, oh my community, oh so forth. That question is vibrant in our community as well. That really struck me as this not only is a question worth researching, but a book worth writing. And so that's what I start the book out talking about. Now, as I start to wrestling with the question in chapter 2, there's a quote here by Cameron Carter: Christianity in our age, in our moment, has functioned in and as, shall we say, the midwife of the production of social misery. Contemporary Christianity struggles to lead in matters of social justice and often is seen as contributor or even sponsor of social injustice. As difficult as that is to hear for some of us, it is the way that people experience the faith in contemporary society. And so this, to me, started to get me to understand where the question is coming from in part. So I continued to study. And let me back up here, because I want to point out a little bit something that I discovered in the research section. At the Public Religion Research Institute, Robert P. Jones and David Cox conducted a study on millennials' attitude about the church and using the Middle Collegiate Church in New York as a case study. The results revealed that a large number of millennials view the church as judgmental and oppressive. Many are leaving the church, and the few that remain do not attend weekly worship. Jones and Cox explained that in addition to the decline of church-going millennials, those who do go are increasingly ashamed to let their friends know they are Christians. Now, what I discovered in this research is that this question of is Christianity the white man's religion is both a literal question and a metaphorical question. So a literal question among many African American, black and brown folks, millennials and Gen Zs. But it's also a metaphorical question for white millennials. So what I tried to do is try to capture a concern that fits under a broad enough umbrella so that it will communicate a broader message than simply white-black, though the white-black thing does have a historical connotation. So young people tend to view Christianity as small-minded and focus more on the church as an institution than everyday life situations such as poverty, abuse, human rights, women's rights, identity, significance, and other social justice concerns. For them, spirituality rather involves all of life, including nature. So African-American millennial blogger and former Christian Luna Malbrooks explains, and I say this in quote her in the book, steadily, it seems like when we move away from the Christian church, we move toward less organized spiritual practices based on traditional African spirituality. There have been no knocks at the door, on the door, no pamphlets, no billboards, no late night hotlines, no viral video campaigns, and yet an unnamed spiritual movement re-imaging African tradition and nature-centered spirituality has been growing among young black Americans. By the same token, even white millennials are getting increasingly attracted to science of consciousness, Wiccans, and witches, and other forms of spirituality, witchcraft and other forms of spirituality. And it's for a very similar reason, this feeling that as if organized and institutional Christianity does not speak to spirituality or the things of concern for them in everyday life, and even more concerned, what does it have to say about the issues that divide people in the streets? That, for me, is a very, very heavy conversation. So move along here. So this is why Cameron Carter, who's a scholar who makes this statement, Christianity in our age, in our moment, has functioned in and as, shall we say, the midwife of the production of social misery. Now, chapter 3, I call it the quest for the souls. Black bodies have historically been traumatized. We're talking about slavery, talking about Jim Crow, talking about lynching, talking about, and all of that is related to it. And the souls of black folk are in search for identity affirmation, soul care, and the spiritual search for a power that is bigger than us. So this chapter points out that the revival of race-based religions and new alternative spiritualities are on the rise. For example, the more science. At the heart of the more science message is a rejection of pejorative lingo such as Negro and Black and African and other forms that were believed to carry a negative connotation. Instead, followers were taught that black people were in reality descendants of the Moor people who have been historically a powerful and conquering people and ruled in Europe for centuries. Such teaching gained some traction among black urbanites because it conferred an identity that put them on par with the oppressive white population who mostly immigrated from Western Europe. You see, one of the challenges is that much of the racism, or all of the racism in our society, historically was sponsored or supported by religious groups. The Holocaust in Germany was sponsored by a religious group. And those realities must be acknowledged. And you can't just act like that didn't happen. Because his history has everything to do with the present. And generational trauma has everything to do with current trauma. So it doesn't mean it negates the thing itself, but it does mean that if you don't confront it, you're bound to repeat it. So the more science really is dealing with an issue that is a historical issue. That historical issue is that African Americans don't have a nation other than this nation. And what I mean by that is when Africans came to this country from different tribes, they were forged into a people, a one people, when there were many different people. Many different tribes of many different nations. In Nigeria, there are over 300 tribes. Well, actually, there are 300 nations, which means there are 300 cultures, and the only thing they have in common is a dark skin tone, because the cultures often compete. For example, I was in Nigeria with the Efi people, and historically, the Efi people believe that twins are a curse. Historically, not now, just historically, the culture was that to have twins is to bring a curse in the community. So whenever anybody had twins, they would take them to a forest of no return, or they would beat their heads or find ways to get rid of the evil spirit out of their community. But the Yoruba people saw twins as good luck. And they would welcome, everybody wants twins because it brings good luck into the community. The point that I'm making is you take Yoruba and Efi people, now it's much more to the differences of culture than that, but that's just an example. You bring people from those two tribes to America as slaves, the language is different, their culture is different. Now they've been forged in the fire furnace of chattel slavery. And now they have to become one, although they are very different. That's what I mean. The African American experience was born out of trauma. So then generationally, you have a wounded people by virtue of being forged together as a nation in trauma. And right after that, then they were forced that they couldn't even marry each other. 1810, they couldn't marry each other. Law, they can't marry each other. Why? Because have you ever heard of a puppy mill? That's what they did to black folks. So that's the people that's where we came from. You can't ignore that as if, oh, that was in the past. No, it has everything to do with a lot of things. Culture, the way we interact, and it has a positive side because we created such contribution to society. But here's the point. When your whole culture was forged, and as far back as you can locate, is slavery, before Ancestry.com. And when I put my stuff into Ancestry.com, I'm still not clear where I came from. It sends me all over the continent of Africa. I'm like, well, everybody is in my heritage. A lot of slavery going, a lot of stuff going on there. Point is, the more science wanted to give dignity in the middle of that chaos. And so they wanted to eradicate all the negativity and provide some sort of overarching affirmation of identity, because they understood that you can't move forward if all you know is something negative. So they wanted to revision identity, and that is attractive in a generation that is in search of identity. Black Hebrew Israelites. The term Black Israelites is a broad category for systems of faith that hold to the belief that African Americans are descendants of biblical Israelites. Jacob S. Dorman, in his book, Chosen People, The Rise of American Black Israelite Religions, references a statement by Azel ben Israel, a member of the original Hebrew Israelites of Dimona, Israel, who remarked, "It isn't a religion as such that I follow. It's the belief that I am a descendant and that black people in America are descendants of biblical Israelites. We adhere to the laws written in the Bible." You see, it's that desire, whether that is a fact or not, there is a desire to belong to something and some destiny, some history that's bigger than the one that we can relate to. Because in most schools, when you look at the textbooks, Black history starts with they came across the ocean. That's where African Americans, typically who are in the public school, learn that our heritage started when we were brought across the Atlantic to be slaves. So this deep desire to have a connection with something that's far-reaching and greater dignity than slavery is driving a lot of this. Then, Nation of Islam. Black Hebrew Israelites, that's an example there. I remember I was at Yale, and I went to get a haircut, came out, and a man stopped me on the street and said, "Hey, brother, do you know who you are?" I said, "Yeah, I know, I think I do." And then he was like, "You are a chosen people. You are Israelite, brother. You are one of the lost tribes." And he's just telling me all this stuff, right? He was trying to give me some identity because he believed that somehow I needed to see myself connected to something bigger than the experience of African American history here in this country. So anyway, moving right along. African spiritual, let me just mention here because I left, okay, there we go. African spiritual systems. So particularly millennials with indigenous ancestry. An increasing number of millennial religious scholars, theologically trained preachers, as well as those who are spiritual but not religious, have begun praying to the ancestors. I find this even, what I mean is I find this even among Christian pastors, where they want to bridge the gap between history and the present beyond vicissitudes of concrete situations. They believe that connecting with the ancient spiritual world is key to the quest of their souls. So then you'll find, when I go to Africa, and I've been quite a bit, every time I go, the going joke is, since I don't really know what my tribe I came from, every tribe I encounter, I tell them I'm that tribe. I was with the Maasai people, I said, I'm Maasai. I was with the Zulu, I said, I'm Zulu. With the Effie people, said, since I don't know who I am, I decided today I'm Effie. So it's kind of the thing that I do everywhere I go. Anyway, but it's one of those things where you'll find a lot of African Americans sort of drawn up on broadly African identities to find some way of connecting with the continent. Now, notwithstanding, some people actually do know what tribe they came from. I don't know because I can't figure it all out. But there are some people who do know, and they try to get deeper into that identity. And then we have the Nation of Islam. This is arguably the most influential of black identity religious sects due to the popularity of its leaders, Malcolm X, who was a bold and passionate advocate for justice and the self-determination of black people in America. And you probably have heard of his name. He was the antithesis to Martin Luther King for most of his career. What got him killed was that he started to believe that there was more in common that we had separately. But for most of his earlier career, while Martin Luther King was singing "We Shall Overcome," he was saying, "Stop singing and start slinging." He was very passionate about, nothing's going to change if you don't fight for it in that such a thing. And he wanted to rename himself with an X rather than his birth last name, because most African Americans have names that were given to them by slave masters. So part of the quest for the soul is try to find who I am independently of an oppressive name. Names mean a lot. People's names, right? So this idea that I can't be in touch with who I am because I have somebody else's name tagged on me is a real thing for some people. Then the legacy of the black church is under threat. W.E.B. Du Bois paints a picture of the role that the church in the black community played as a center of gravity for the development of the flourishing community. The black church has a beautiful and miraculous legacy that must not be overlooked. Unfortunately, this legacy has over time become fractured. The black church is no longer as influential as it was. And that's partly because, according to this research, this sort of affinity toward institutionalizing itself and becoming becoming a mission in and of itself, rather than the church's mission becoming the community. Does that make sense? Anyway, chapter 4, the church and the search for identity. The origin of Christianity was all about a pathway for all of humanity to experience redemption and reconciliation with God, and each through Jesus Christ. That's what I'm arguing is, if you return to what the New Testament was about. Obviously, I'm also arguing that the church as an institution, the history of Christianity, deviated painfully from that original message. So Kelly Brown Douglas said that Christianity has provided, she was a theologian, who said that Christianity has provided theological legitimation for the overall dehumanizing denigration of black bodies. Yet it has also sustained black people in their struggle against white dehumanization. So what she's saying is that on the one hand, Christianity has been helpful, and on the other hand, it has been hurtful. So in this chapter, part of what I'm trying to get at is when you have this type of tension, between helpful and hurtful, where do you go to try to redeem the helpful and to dismiss the hurtful? Ideologically, philosophically, you get it, theologically. So then I want to go back to the original text and rediscover what Christianity is about in the New Testament. So part 2, the question then shifts from why is this question a big question, and start slowly shifting to, how do we get here? And part 2 is wrestling with the question, have we been taught to misread the Bible? Because I'm not sure that the Bible sanctions what we see, if you read it as it's written, and also with consideration of a historical context. Much of Christian thinking has been shaped by poor biblical interpretation rather than historical, contextual readings of Scripture. Most of my most intense arguments with Christians have been around matters of interpretation and not the actual biblical text in question. Because when one considers the text itself, one must also understand the historical context and not just interpret the scripture in light of what it says, but what is meant by what it said. When I was at Boston University and I was studying for comps for my, and I had requested because I had a strong biblical studies background. So I requested to translate, that Koine Greek be one of my languages. And I remember my proctor, who was the professor there, Dr. Wilson, said, when you translate, make sure that you consider not just what it says, but what is meant by what it said. Considering the historical context, not just the word that is being used, but what did that word mean in first century. So you can't just get that by looking up in dictionary. You got to also understand the historical social context that gives rise to what's there. That will help you get at a better interpretation of the text itself. Otherwise, just read a response. You're imposing meaning on the text. One time, a young waiter I knew from a local restaurant who loved to discuss the Bible with me wanted to talk about baptism in the Spirit. She explained something she had been reading, and I struggled to follow her interpretation of the passage. When she whipped out the study Bible to prove a point, I noticed that she was relying on the commentary footnotes. And this new Bible student was being shaped by certain interpretations of Scripture more than Scripture itself. That's an example. And this is where these study Bibles often become a painful assault on the faith in many ways. For example, the Date Study Bible. It had for many years, until recently, they had in there that black people came from a curse. So whenever you read the Bible, you read it like she did and also read the footnote. What's becoming in your subconscious is that the Bible has declared you to be a curse. So what does that do for a person who wants to believe the Bible? Makes them reject it or feed into the sort of slave, some kind of thing. That's where we came from. And you have this sort of inferior way of self-perception and maneuvering in the world. So it wasn't until the 1960s, American scholars such as James Cone, Kane Hope Felder, and Brian K. Blunt, and others have stood on the margins criticizing how commentaries and theological education have for centuries shaped understandings of Scripture and Christianity in the image of whiteness. For a long time, their criticisms were brushed off as radical, unfounded, because they did not align with mainstream Christian thought. And you find that sometimes in theological schools today, even when you're reading certain theological frameworks that are born out of the black, brown community, it's usually called, that's contextual theology. But over here, there's a thing called systematic theology, which lords over the marginalized group, the FUBU groups, right? You have black theology, that's the black theology, black thinking for black people. And you have the Latin American, that's the Latin thinking for, it's kind of structured that way in many seminaries. So when that happens, even people who are in those groups, they are being trained by virtue of the academy that what they think and reflect upon is subpar to the mainstream systematic theology that's dominated by white males. Then, if you're a woman and you want to be in ministry, the women theology over here, there's women theology. But if you really want real theology, just go with systematic, because that's the dominant. So you have this overarching patriarchy going on in the academy itself. The structure, the way it's all done, it's a message in all that, right? That subjugates people and marginalized people and dismiss new thought as not worthy of sort of a centralized way of thinking. Experience matters in the shaping of Christian mind. This is important. Any religious mind. Colonial approaches reject the notion that new interpretations of Scripture emerge when both the biblical context and contemporary context of vast cultural diversities meet. In other words, what I'm trying to get across here is that while we had the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation, that freed the slaves from the plantation to no man's land because they didn't have any way to get there. Also, did you know that there were reparations? Did you guys know there were reparations? This idea of conversation about reparation is not a new thought, but here's what gets you. The reparations were not for the slaves. The reparations were for the slave owners. Because this nation said they're going to lose their help. They're going to need help. So give them money. And then promised the slaves 40 acres and a mule, and they never got it. So you ask the question, why is black community generational wealth 10 times lower than the white community? Well, it kind of started someplace in the inception of the nation and during the Reconstruction, right? That is a historical fact. It's not even like an opinion. Do I believe they didn't? Yes, they did that. So any conversation about reparations now, it's like, oh, don't talk about that. Oh, well, the nation did it during the Reconstruction, right? So then what persists is ideological colonization, philosophical colonization. It's harder to detangle that with an edict or with Emancipation Proclamation than say, we shall stop the way we're thinking, right? So the ideological framework continued. No wonder, and this nation never did what the Hebrew people in the Bible did with the book of Lamentation, paused and lamented anything. So what do we get? We get statues built at the end of the Reconstruction from the Confederate monuments and so forth to preserve an ideological framework by reminding us of something that happened in the past, which the memory itself sustains the ideological framework into the future. Even in Norfolk, they just took it down a few years ago, that statue downtown Norfolk. It was 5 feet away from the slave auction block. You think that was an accident? Absolutely not. It's preserving the history of who this city belongs to. You see, it's ideological colonization. All right, so I'm gonna hasten now in just a couple minutes because I get too carried away and I just looked at the clock and realized where we are. All right, so I'm gonna talk about this, the rest of this in summary. So what happens is the Bible becomes a legitimizing agency for an ideological framework that oppresses people, that over time is not what the Bible said, is what is believed the Bible to mean. So then, because there were groups of people that wanted to preserve ideological frameworks through the 1900s, guess what happened? Jesus became white, Moses was white, everything heroic in the Bible was white, and everything that was bad was black. Pharaoh was black, you know, and then painted a picture of the guy who carried the cross was a slave, black slave. In reality, none of that was true. But the idea is, a bishop called me not too long ago and said, hey, was Obed-Edom in the Old Testament, was he black? I said, well, the problem is in the question, because you are presupposing that there might be one or two black people, good black people in the Bible, amid all the rest of the good white people. And in this book, the rest of the book, I argue that the characters in the Bible are much more colorful than the movies have given them credit of being, than the books have given them credit of being. And therefore, when people of color look at the Bible, you can actually see people of color that you didn't even know there were people of color. So there were good people, there were intellectual people, there are theological people, there are people who God cared about who were black. People like Mark, who wrote the first gospel of the New Testament. Few people know that he was African. And people say, why didn't they tell us that? Because it wasn't important for them to tell you that. They want you to stay subjected. You can't talk about people who were smart the first in the Bible because the Bible is an authoritative book, you know, during in the history of the country. So then only tell the parts that seem to subjugate black people. Last thing. I went to Angola, and I studied slavery in Angola. In Angola, the historical message that were given to the slaves, because Africans historically have been religious people, so one way to get to them is to start talking religion. So they started convincing them that the Bible was true and that it was a book of God, and the reason why they were dark-skinned was because they were cursed from Cain. That's where they got the curse of Cain from. Then I went to Nigeria and studied slavery, and I learned that the way that they subjugated the slaves in Nigeria was convince them that they were the curse of Ham. When the reality is, neither one is true. In fact, there was no curse of Ham, right? Right? So that was a narrative about a curse in the household of Ham, but to frame it that way means to suggest that his son Cush, who was a progenitor of the black people, or believed to have been, may have been in the curse when actually the text doesn't say that at all. So you see what I'm saying? Revisiting the text and dismantling a colonized way of reading the text brings new insight, and I argue that then the Bible becomes more relevant to social concerns than has been given credit. I like to say James Cone, for example. He's known as a black theologian who resisted this ideological slavery, right? So James Cone's book, like Cross and Lynching Tree, is the one I talk about in the book, where he wants to revisit the message of the cross and see how Jesus identifies with the abused people who were hung by the KKK. Right? So that's a great place to start, because that helps to give new insight, theological insight, on the experience of black pain. And then he talks quite a bit about how many times we focus on Easter Sunday, the beauty of Easter Sunday, because sort of an ideological, colonized, romanticized notion of Easter focuses on the resurrection and the beauty of all that. But he wants to say, no, you have to start with the cross. And there's beauty in the cross. Not because it was necessary, but because evil people did it. You see. So then you say, okay, God is with me in my suffering. Rather than God's with me when I'm good, God abandons me when I'm in suffering. He's trying to wrestle with that. Yeah, the question is, do I think that it's actually possible that objective history can find its way into the schools? You know, objective is I think a stretch, because even this way is not particularly objective, right? It's a way of trying to connect with something bigger than myself to make sense of my pain. So that's not really objective either. But I do think that a more realistic approach, which is to invite all of human experience to the search of history and theology and philosophy, and give equal dignity to the many ways that we enter into that space. And that's one of the arguments I'm trying to make. I think that's more realistic, because the human experience comes from different places. And what I'm not trying to do is say that the white way of entering the text is wrong. I'm saying that it has been abused historically, but we need a black Jesus. We need in terms of, from my perspective, in terms of faith, we need a black God, a woman God, we need a white God, we need an Asian God, because all of the kaleidoscope of human existence has to enter into the divine space. And that's what the young people are looking for when they say, I'm spiritual but not religious. I need a God that connects with my everyday life. And I think that a more objective way of reading Scripture reveals that that there are many ways to embrace God as so far as the human experience is concerned. In other words, if I'm abandoned, I can connect with God. If I'm rich, I can connect with God, even if he tells me to sell it out and give it to the poor. There is always some way to connect with a God who cares. Historically, though, the way it has been was a God who lifts whiteness and demeans blackness. And that is heretical. And lifts men and subjugates women. I mean, whatever you want, if your greed drives you in this way, that direction, you can use God and make your case. And so that's how we got a white Jesus, for example. We need Jesus to be white, but of course Jesus is white because white people are right and God is right. Black is wrong. We can't tell him he's black because then they become equal with us. And, you can't do that. You see that? So then the agenda is driving. And what I'm seeing now, we talk about Christian nationalism. What I'm seeing now is something very similar, where the culture frequently hijacks the mission of faith. And now we got, God is Republican or God is Democrat. And you have to make God one of those so you can subjugate all the people who love God. If you love God, you're going to vote Republican. Now, come on. You love God, you're going to vote this way. So that's a way of trying to appeal to a higher power to control people. And that's the way faith is often used to control people rather than to support, to enhance, to embrace people. And that's what I'm finding that question, is Christianity white man's religion, is coming from. But how can we make Jesus more? Or how can we get out of the way of what Jesus is doing? if your faith is Christianity, with respect to those who are not Christian, if the question is, how do you bear witness to Christianity that is not lifting patriarchy and excluding women, right? And I think that there's much there in the text that seems to support that women should participate than not. And historically, is that way. I mean, and there's always the negotiation of culture and faith, right? How do you socialize faith in light of culture? And how do you change culture in light of faith, right? But historically, culture drove the faith. So if this is a misogynist culture, then suddenly the faith is going to be misogynist, right? If this is a white domineering culture, then the faith is going to adapt to that rather than the faith critiquing that. Yeah, that's part of it. It's not appealing to them, but I think that in addition to not appealing, or the depth of the question of what do we mean by not appealing has to do with how does this speak to the questions in my everyday life. And those questions, increasingly among millennials, it seems, and Gen Zs, have to do with social justice concerns. And so part of it has to do with, I feel more connected with God, the universe, whatever it may be, when I'm helping someone, when I'm fighting, when I'm marching in the streets for George Floyd, justice for George Floyd, whatever. That's part of their religious experience, but not exclusively. Also, for some, sports is their religion. And I'd say that in many ways, what mirrors that, in my observation, is for many adults, the parents, the faith itself is not their religion anyway. It's republicanism and it's the politics that really their religion, right? That's increasingly becoming their religion. Siding with an ideological framework that is dividing the nation is really the new religion. And Christianity becomes the excuse for it. So, and I don't think that the millennials and Gen Zs are willing to play that game. I don't need the Bible to justify what I'm trying to do. I just want to be connected to the universe. I just want to be connected to God. And all the other crazy stuff is just unnecessary because, as one girl said to me, I pray to myself. So there is no need for allegiance to an organized or institutionalized religion. I think it's compounded by a variety of things, including culture. For example, millennials and Gen Zs typically loyalty to things are different between the baby boomers, the Gen X's, and millennials and Gen Zs. Older people tend to be more loyal to groups, to jobs, to community. Millennials and Gen Zs tend to attend to a greater loyalty to their own ideas and their own ambitions. So then you don't really know if they're going to be around because they're in pursuit of their dream, and so I think loyalty to the group is different, and that plays a part in why it's easier for them to break away, black and white. I think that plays a part in it as well. So my answer really is yes and no. My answer that historically the way the faith has been constructed through centuries, through people in the Western world, it has been absolutely catered to that of the white man's religion. And I located the shift in the 1400s when I really think it should probably be before then. When Portugal, when the King Alfonso received authority to go down to Angola and other parts of Africa to subjugate the folks there to slavery. The Pope did that. And the Pope did it by demeaning the humanity of the African people. Because whenever you want to subjugate somebody, you got to make them seem less than human. So, and that really started the journey of the New World with people who have been. So it has been, the answer is yes. The no answer is that I wanted to revisit the text where it all got started. If Jesus is the progenitor of the faith, and what was he about? Because quite frankly, not only has this been oppressive to black people, but it was a Christian tradition that not all Christians, because people like Bonhoeffer was killed for trying to fight back, but in Germany, the Holocaust, there were Christian groups that supported that. Bonhoeffer came to the United States and went to Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York and studied the African American expression of the faith, and he wanted to carry his new insight of the faith back to Germany, and that's what got him killed. He did something radical, but it still was fueled by his desire to live faithful to what he believed to be a redeemed version of what Jesus was about. So I wanted to do something like that. And so that's why it's yes and no. Bit of both. And great question. I mentioned this in the book that the YouTube is a new pulpit. So time and time again, the young people tell me I couldn't sleep at night, so I was online and I was listening to all this stuff. And and they tell me about these new people that I didn't know about, but they got thousands of followers. Some people with these very interesting spiritualist ideas, and they find them because if somebody told them about them, and they really dig into that stuff. So YouTube, and also the other, TikTok, all that. It really does feed. You see it with people, even locally, who have committed suicide. They following these challenges on TikTok. Well, it's the same thing when it comes to religious. If they get some ideas, they believe that stuff and try it. So yeah. And if it speaks to you on a day when you feel like I really need to hear that, all of a sudden, that's your new preacher. You're always looking for that person because they got something they need to say to you. It's amazing how it works. I have a both yes and no answer to that. One, because I think the no is because I have observed some churches when they try to be so cool that they're nothing. It's like, so why even do this? It's just too cool for anybody. and I'm using loose language there, but I think you know what I mean. It's like you're trying too hard. Be something that people would actually follow, rather than try to be everything and nobody follows. And then there is the side that I say yes, because I think that at least if they are in search of the faith that I believe the New Testament is really after, I think that they would be more. They would be in the streets with the crowd who is saying, say her name. And I think that's the Jesus. I mean, personally, I think that's what Jesus is doing when he's healing the blind and things like that. He's not saying kill those people, oppress those people. That's not what he's doing. But that's what the faith has done. And that's what sometimes I think messages in churches are, how can we be so holy that we are so different from everybody that everybody is somehow going to hell but us? No, that's a problem, right? Yeah, I think so. I was in Dallas in the heart of it, and one of why I felt most spiritual was when I was passing out boxes to thousands of people who needed food. And so what you're saying, I felt connected with God more then than at church. My own life and experience, I've never had a desire to be a traditional type pastor. I wanted to be in the community helping the homeless, because when I was a chaplain in the prison is when I met God. And I met God among the distressed. And I identified that God because it was a God of my knowing, but I met God and experienced God in a way that I really didn't experience in the community of the weekend thing. So it shaped my way of thinking about it. So I can relate to what you're saying is what I'm saying. So I believe, though, the pandemic did create an atmosphere where people realized that you can, and pastors were basically telling people, you don't have to go to church, you can be a Christian at home. And now they want to flip the message. I tell them, you can't change the message now. You said they didn't have to be here. So they're on the street doing stuff in the community, and they're finding their God and finding God and connecting with humanity that way. And I think it really did change. And I think that's a good thing. I am glad I wrote the book, and I really wish that I wish I could have released it after the pandemic. It would be a lot bigger book because of all the different things that we experienced from George Floyd. It came out right after the George Floyd incident. And there was so much that happened during that time, including I was asked to go to Minnesota to speak to the students at the university that was right by where the incident happened that fall. So to meet with students, to see how they interacted with that situation, how it changed them. I spoke in classes about racism and the history of racism and things like social justice. All that would be in the book. Because in the last chapter, when I talk about a way forward, it's connected to this question. The way forward, I argue, is to find ways to express our faith in the community that builds up humanity rather than cause division. And I try to live that out through the Urban Renewal Center. Our whole mantra is, how do we bring people together? So in our main matrix is, how much diversity did we pull together for that event? It seems superficial, but I don't think it is. I think the more we can think about bringing people together, the better we're living more faithfully to what I think that the New Testament is about. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.